Hey everybody, welcome to week 6 of Intro to Cultural Anthropology. I'm still Faye, and this week we are talking about ethnicity and race. So this is one of my favorite chapters of the whole book, closely followed, well, probably closely preceded by gender, which is my own area of research. But I find what anthropology has to say about race in particular to be fascinating, and hopefully you all found it so as well as you were reading through both our textbook this week and the fish article. So we're going to talk about both of those briefly in hopes again of meeting YouTube's guideline of when the video has to cut off. This week we're going to talk about why anthropologists have rejected the concept of race as we usually think about it, how ethnicity and race are socially constructed not only here at home but in various places around the world, and some of the positive and negative aspects of ethnicity. And we're going to start with ethnic groups. An ethnic group is a group whose members share certain beliefs, values, habits, customs, and norms because of their common background. They have an identification with and feel part of an ethnic group, and that they are not part of other ethnic groups because of this affiliation. Now, this can be based on a geographical location that they now live, that they used to live, or that they want to live, or it can be something more broad. So you should think here now about whether you have an ethnic group. Some folks in the U.S. feel strongly that they are, for instance, Italian American, or their families are recent immigrants, and so they have a strong tie to somewhere else. Some folks feel like their ethnic identification is American. And some folks are much closer tied to a racial identification, which we're going to get into much more further on in the video. Ethnic feelings and their associated behavior vary in intensity within ethnic groups and countries and over time. We particularly see this with migration patterns. For instance, again, if your parents came from somewhere else, they may be much more strongly identified with thinking of themselves as Pakistani or Mexican than you are, when you might think of yourself as Pakistani American or even just American and not want to be carrying that ethnic identity along with you. There are cultural differences associated with one's ethnicity that can also be tied to class, region, or religion. And we're going to talk a little bit about how that shows up in the census, where we are divided up into what they call racial or ethnic identification. This used to just be races, and then the census got a little more wise to that they were dividing people up into things that weren't really racial groups even as we thought of it. The most interesting example of this is probably Hispanic, which the U.S. has defined as a racial group for quite some time. It was not that way in the last census, but Hispanic just means Spanish-speaking and refers to all kinds of people from Central and Southern America, and most of those folks would not necessarily define themselves as being all part of one particular racial group. And, as we'll see later on, racial groups are usually associated with supposed biological traits, right? Whereas Hispanic is really about all these folks speak Spanish. So ethnicity is part of our status. And here we're not talking about status as hierarchy exactly, right? Like some people have more status than others. But that our status is a position that people occupy in society. And we all have lots of them. We have both ascribed status, things that we have little or no choice about occupying. Things like, for me, this would be daughter, or, let's see, what's another good described one? Female, although some folks would argue that that one's more mobile than it is. As opposed to achieved status, which are things that we acquire, status we acquire through choices, action, efforts, talents, or accomplishments. This could be either positive or negative. In my case, for instance, this would be professor. And yours would probably be student, would be one of them. We all carry all kinds of statuses, and if you're following along in the PowerPoint right now, you'll see that I put up a chart, it's also in our textbook, which shows both the difference between ascribed status and achieved status, and the number of statuses that one person can be holding within their body. The person in the example is a student, a friend, an employee, a dormitory resident, and a classmate. Those are all achieved statuses, things based on their own choices or accomplishments. But at the same time, they're a sister, African American, daughter, 19 years old, your age is then ascribed to you, and female. So, and all of those things are in play in different ways in different parts of your life. Some statuses, particularly ascribed ones, can be mutually exclusive. For instance, we don't generally think in the U.S., although, again, this is a little more mobile than it used to be, that folks can be both female and male, although this is not necessarily true in some other cultural groups. Some statuses are contextual, where we are participating in a situational negotiation of social identity. For instance, in this moment, I am very much in my personal achieved status as a professor. But when I turn this video off and go to have dinner with my family, that is not going to be my primary status, right? And we all do this. We move between daughter and sister and student and friend and employee, depending on the situation we're in at any given point. In many societies, your ascribed status is associated with your position in the social political hierarchy, or where you belong in a ranking of things we think have more power and more secure access to resources than other groups, right? Okay, so that, of course, leads us in to race. Now, over time, we've had two different ways of thinking about race and human biological diversity. And we're going to start with the one that is both our historical understanding of race and is what Fish describes in the article we read for this week as our folk taxonomy of race. And that is racial classification. In racial classification, we assign organisms to categories purportedly based on their common ancestry. In theory, this means that biological race would be a geographically isolated subdivision of a species. We'd be able to say, this is clearly what a race is, and this is another race, and here's the boundary between them. Here's what separates this race from this race. Generally not actually true in our understanding of human biological diversity. In fact, we often see much more diversity within the groups we think of as races than we do between them. Humanity lacks these races, even though we think that we have them, because populations haven't been isolated enough. We actually all come from one place on our planet and have migrated out from there, mutating and diversifying as we do that. But there's never been like these very distinct, geographically separated, not connected in any way races in the way we would think of some other animals, like breeds of dog. Okay, early scholars, however, used phenotypical traits, this is the way that our genes are expressed in our bodies, as manifest biology, that our anatomy and physiology just by looking at us, divided us up into race. This was really compatible with the political use of race during the colonial period, where white Europeans wanted any reason they could to be completely separate from the Africans, Asians, and Native American folks that they were basically subjugating. So they ended up with this schema, right, where they divided everybody up into us and not us. There were us and the black people and us and the Asian people, right? And then it got divided up again another couple of times, trying to make it fit better when we discovered more and more people around the world, folks that didn't fit into those three categories. Now, at this point in the conversation, I always have students say, but I'm Caucasian. I've been labeling myself Caucasian because I think on one hand that it's a little more politically correct than just saying white. I've been labeling myself Caucasian this whole time. Well, I want to share with you that those terms, Caucasoid, Mongoloid, and Negroid, were really just coming up with scientific terms to sort of try to justify the system that had no real basis in fact. So when you talk about yourself as being Caucasian, you are on one hand sort of saying, well, I have ancestors that came from somewhere around the Caucasoid Mountains, which, you know, there's a lot of white people there. But you're not really giving any information at all about your personal biology, even though we think we really are. And all kinds of science is based on the idea that we can divide human beings up into these racial categories. Now, the problems with this approach is, of course, that color-based racial labels are not accurate. Take Hispanic. Again, we talked about how that's problematic, but we think of it as brown, right? Hispanic, brown people. Lots of brown folks around the world, not not Spanish-speaking, and folks that self-identify as Hispanic or Latina have a whole lot of diversity in what their phenotypical expression is, right? There's lots of populations that don't fit neatly into any one of those three great races, and there's not one single consistent trait that can be used as a basis for racial classification, even though we do try to do that. Phenotypical similarities and differences do not necessarily have a genetic basis. Instead, we vary from one clime to another as we move around the planet. So let's